When I was born in 1900, my great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was on the throne. Since then, I had lived through the reigns of 4 kings. In the aftermath of 2 world wars, almost every vestige of Victorian Britain had been swept away. I've seen enormous changes in my lifetime. In fact, I've had quite a lot to do with some of them. But one thing I'm happy to say has not changed. When I reached the last phase of my career and fulfilled ambitions I'd hardly dare to admit, even to myself, a new queen was on the throne, and the British monarchy was as strong and well-loved as it was when I was born.
Queen Elizabeth II was summoned suddenly to her throne. With the Duke of Edinburgh, she had been on her way to tour Australia and New Zealand. The unexpected news of her father's death reached her in East Africa, and she flew home at once. It was a sad moment for all the royal family.
King George VI, my cousin Bertie, was a very old friend. In fact, our friendship went back even further than my friendship with his brother, the Duke of Windsor. We were both sailors. We'd been in the Grand Fleet together during the First World War. And being a few years older than me, he'd been at the Battle of Jutland, which I'd just missed. We saw a lot of each other at Cambridge in 1919. And I knew only too well how distressed he was when he had the responsibilities of kingship thrust upon him. George VI never had the immediate charm or ease of manner that his brother had. As Duke of York, he struggled to overcome his natural diffidence.
If I held you on my knee, oh, how happy I should be under.
Later, as king, he even overcame the stammer which had always made his life difficult. He became a fine king, very much loved and admired. He had enormous common sense, which I feel sure his prime ministers found a great source of strength. I consider that his reign was a great demonstration of the value of constitutional monarchy under a sensible, high-minded king. Strangely enough, I felt even closer to our new queen than to either her father or her uncle, though both were my contemporaries and friends. She and her sister, Princess Margaret, were playmates of our daughters, Patricia and Pamela, and so we got to know them well as children. And then, after her marriage, when my nephew Philip was serving in the Mediterranean Fleet, they shared house with us in Malta. I look back on that as one of the happiest times of my life. Young as she was, I was quite certain she'd make a superlative queen.
In Westminster Abbey, ceremonial returned, in a blaze of light and colour. The pageant of the coronation in June 1953 brightened the austerities of the post-war scene. In the crowded London streets, not even drenching rain could diminish the enthusiasm as the young queen went by. And these crowds had something else to cheer about. It was on Coronation Day itself that Britain learned that Sir Edmund Hillary and the Sherpa Tenzing had succeeded in their quest. They were the first men to climb the world's highest mountain, Everest. It seemed a good omen for the opening of the new reign. And more good news soon followed. Further east at Panmunjom, an armistice was signed, which brought peace in Korea. A hard war, dangerous to the peace of the world, ended in July, 1 month after the coronation. In the next year, there came an interval in another Eastern drama. Ever since the liberation of Indochina by Mountbatten's forces in 1945, the French had tried to hold their colony by force of arms. In May 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, they suffered disaster at the hands of the Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh. French imperialism was compelled to accept defeat in Vietnam. 2 months later, an armistice was signed in Geneva, which confirmed the communist hold on North Vietnam, but established the independence of the remaining states of Indochina. At the Geneva conference, the outstanding mediator was the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Less than a year later, Sir Winston Churchill, whose second ministry had lasted 4 years, resigned. He was succeeded by Eden on April the 6th, 1955, amid general acclamation, with his Geneva laurels still fresh upon him.
12 days after Anthony Eden became Prime Minister, my life's ambition was fulfilled. I became First Sea Lord. Actually, it was Winston Churchill who was responsible for the appointment, one of his last acts in high office. That made him the only man to have appointed a father and son to the post of First Sea Lord. It also meant that he got over his hard feelings about what I'd done in India. I was glad about that. And of course, it was a thrill to sit here in the chair my father had occupied and to tackle the same responsibilities he'd had to face. So here I was on the board of Admiralty, the First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy. Now, dotted across my life, as those who followed the series will have gathered, there were many occasions when I had found myself more or less at loggerheads with the board. As a junior officer, I used to enjoy the jokes that circulated about the Board of Admiralty. We used to call their lordships their block ships. Pointing to a board drifting by on the tide, someone would say, "What's the difference between that board and the Board of Admiralty?" Answer, "That board's moving," and so on. And now it was my turn to be the target of the jokes. I hope I wasn't a block ship. In fact, my role, like my father's, and like Admiral Fisher before him, when I was still a small boy, was to be a reformer. And I reached this conclusion. When we were the greatest naval power in the world, change did not benefit us. Quite the opposite. So the Admiralty became instinctively conservative and opposed to change. That was one thing. Secondly, as a committee, it was naturally slow-moving. Most committees are. But whenever anything good was done, there was a tendency for the Navy to credit it to one particular officer. While if something unpopular happened, the board as a whole was blamed. This wasn't really fair, because the final approval for everything had to come from the board. There's nothing like being at the receiving end to help you to see the other point of view.
In 1955, 10 years after the Second World War, Britain possessed unchallenged great power status. Anthony Eden's diplomatic skill, the patience and persistence which he brought to difficult negotiations, his prestige as Churchill's heir, the apparent permanence of Commonwealth ties, all contributed to uphold the tradition of greatness. Yet significant changes were already at work, closely affecting Mountbatten and the other chiefs of staff. Ever present in their minds was the new dilemma. The Cold War, the bitter clash between the Soviet Union and her wartime Western allies. The cost of defense in the nuclear age reached figures which had never been dreamt of in peacetime. £1,000 million in 1951. £1,500 million in 1955. Britain was firmly committed to a nuclear policy, an independent deterrent which swallowed up much of the defense budget. At the same time, she maintained large conventional services, which now had all too much of a Second World War look about them. Conscription was still in force, but increasingly unpopular. Equipment in all the services, much of it dating from 1945, badly needed bringing up to date.
I was pretty clear in my mind about what I intended to do if I should be fortunate enough to occupy this seat. The Navy in 1955 I considered was in a dangerously bloated condition. During the war, shore establishments of every kind had proliferated. and many of these were still being kept on, although their numbers were no longer economic. It was time to do some drastic streamlining, both for the sake of the national economy and for the benefit of the service itself. So I set up a committee, the Way Ahead Committee, with myself in the chair and most of my colleagues on the board as members, to review the whole situation. And then things started to move.
And so it is that we've been able to close out of 16 air stations 3 years ago. We shall only keep, out of 19 air stations, we shall only keep 8. The whole of the naval depot of Chatham, the barracks, the schools, everything else, and many other naval establishments are going to be closed. That will, in the long run, save between 6,000 and 7,000 uniformed sailors from shore service. And when the gradual reduction comes on going over to voluntary service, those reductions will fall largely on the shore support and leave the maximum possible number of ships at sea. After all, one joins the Navy to be at sea, and that's where most men want to be, and that's where we want to have them.
When this Union flag is lowered in a few minutes' time, this Royal Dockyard will cease to exist as such after nearly 300 years' service to the Royal Navy.
In the end, we were able to cut down personnel by about 30,000, uniformed and civilians, and save about £15 million a year without losing a single ship from the seagoing fleet. I went round to all our fleets: home, Mediterranean, Far East, East Indies, tub thumping and explaining. I also took this opportunity of having a look at the navies of the Commonwealth, our old associates of 2 world wars, of Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and the young navies of newly independent countries, India, Malaya, Ceylon. Naval morale, which had been drooping a bit, began to revive. But both the Navy and the Commonwealth were now about to undergo a very severe trial.
In June 1956, Colonel Nasser, the firebrand of Egyptian politics, became president of the Republic of Egypt. Egypt's economy was backward, her poverty chronic. To remedy this, Colonel Nasser sought backing for a new irrigation scheme, the Aswan High Dam. Britain and America informed him in July that they would not finance this project. 1 week after this Anglo-American decision, Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had begun. For 3 months, negotiations in London, in Cairo, in the United Nations dragged on. But from beginning to end, there was the clear indication that the British and French governments, the chief shareholders, might use force if they remained dissatisfied with other solutions. As First Sea Lord, Mountbatten would have to find the means of applying such force, which could only be by yet another large combined operation. By October, Anglo-French dissatisfaction was obvious, and an Anglo-French build-up in the Middle East was nearly completed. A further factor was the long-standing quarrel between Egypt and Israel. On October the 29th, Israeli troops invaded Sinai. On November the 5th, in the teeth of world disapproval, and with the Commonwealth sharply divided, British and French forces attacked Port Said. Britain herself was also divided. Anthony Eden firmly believed that this act was a matter of stopping aggression on the dangerous model of the 30s. In other words, a police action.
All my life, I've been a man of peace. Working for peace, striving for peace, negotiating for peace. I've been a League of Nations man and a United Nations man. And I'm still the same man, with the same conviction, the same devotion to peace. I couldn't be other, even if I wished. But I'm utterly convinced that the action we have taken is right.
Hugh Gaitskell, leader of the opposition, took an exactly contrary view.
We have violated the Charter of the United Nations. In doing so, we have betrayed all that Great Britain has stood for in world affairs. Since the war, at least, we have supported every stand against aggression. We did so in the Korean War. We played our part, and we were absolutely right. This was a case of self-defense, collective defense, allowed under the Charter, endorsed unanimously by the Security Council of the United Nations. But today, we stand as the aggressors.
As the British and French entered Port Said, world reaction followed. The United States, Canada, and India condemned their actions with words. The Soviet Union threatened to use rockets. In 48 hours, the British and French made excellent progress. But at the end of that time, the pressures of world opinion and the great stress imposed on the British economy compelled the government to accept the United Nations' insistence on a ceasefire. On November the 15th, a United Nations peacekeeping force arrived in the Suez area, and shortly afterwards the British and French withdrew. The dispute over this fiasco has never died away.
As we all know, there have been recriminations about the very motivation of the Suez policy, about collusion with Israel, about the breakdown of relations with America and the United Nations, about our military preparedness, about going thus far and then suddenly stopping short of our objective. As an ex-chief of staff, I'm not permitted to comment on these matters. But those who follow this television series will realize that the Suez policy was inspired by very different ideas from those I tried to work out in Southeast Asia in 1945-46 and in India in 1947-48. I carried out my duties, but it would be foolish to pretend that I didn't have very grave doubts about the whole thing. And I'd like to say one other thing. In the summer of 1956, when most of Britain was on holiday, but the services had to try to mobilize, we found ourselves in the extraordinary position, being neither at war nor at peace. Nothing could be less satisfactory from the services' point of view. The Navy, with its inherent instant readiness, found this less awkward than the others. The Army and the RAF had great difficulties to contend with. But once the combined force was assembled and got off the mark, the operation went forward with great efficiency. The services didn't let the country down, I'm sure of that.
On January the 9th, 1957, ill health compelled Anthony Eden to resign. He was succeeded as Prime Minister by Harold Macmillan, and in the new ministry, Duncan Sandys took over the Office of Defence. His appointment marked the beginning of a series of searching re-examinations of British defence policy, which continued through the rest of Mountbatten's career. In April 1957, the new Minister of Defence produced a white paper which contained some startling statements. Once again, there was heavy emphasis on the nuclear deterrent. With the Russian rocket threat still fresh in mind, people learned from Mr. Sandys, it must be frankly recognized that there is at present no means of providing adequate protection for the people of this country against the consequences of an attack with nuclear weapons. This makes it more than ever clear that the overriding consideration must be to prevent war rather than to prepare for it. With this in mind, Duncan Sandys concluded, the only existing safeguard against major aggression is the power to threaten retaliation. For the time being, the V-bombers of the RAF remain Britain's deterrent weapon. But the old dilemma continued. The white paper reaffirmed, the frontiers of the free world, particularly in Europe, must be firmly defended on the ground. That would be the Army's role. Then came a statement which disconcerted the Admiralty. The role of naval forces in total war is somewhat uncertain. It may well be that the initial nuclear bombardment and counter-bombardment by aircraft and rockets would be so crippling as to bring the war to an end within a few weeks, or even days, in which case naval operations would not play any significant part. Duncan Sands was in fact challenging the assumption that the war at sea might continue after the war on land had collapsed. This he regarded as unrealistic, but to some at the time, he seemed to be casting deeper doubts upon the Navy's role.
It was a shock, after all we've been doing to streamline the Navy and modernize its outlook, to find ourselves under this heavy attack by the Minister of Defense. I can never remember a time in my career when I didn't enjoy my work, but I must say I found this period very, very trying.
For me, too, it was, to begin with, rather a trying period. When I became Minister of Defense, I made up my mind to do two things. First, to get better value for money through radical changes in the organization and deployment of our forces. And secondly, to integrate the higher control of the three services. As was to be expected, the three service departments didn't exactly welcome the new broom. And to put it mildly, they didn't go out of their way to make my task easier. But Mountbatten was personally most cooperative, and we soon got on very well together. After many private talks and staff meetings, we reached full agreement on the main features of future naval policy.
Together, Duncan Sands and Mountbatten set about the reshaping of the Navy in the 50s. They laid emphasis on mobility, the creation of task forces based on the aircraft carrier, the development of commando carriers for amphibious operations, redefining the role of the Royal Marines, building new ships of revolutionary design. Perhaps most important of all, this forward-looking program gave the Navy renewed confidence in its future. And all the time, for all three services, each year produced its problems. A state of emergency had existed in Cyprus since 1955. The quarrel between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots remained intransigent. Cyprus continued for several years to be a strain on British resources. In July 1957, a revolt in Oman brought a demand for British military aid. In 1958, there was a state of emergency in Aden, another military commitment. And in the same year, paratroops were flown into Jordan at the request of King Hussein. Between 1945 and 1960, more than 50 incidents called for the intervention of British forces. There were hurricanes, there were floods, there were earthquakes. But there were also at least 17 major military operations.
We found that United Nations or no United Nations, NATO or no NATO, deterrent or no deterrent, our soldiers, sailors and airmen had plenty to keep them occupied. These tasks had never been easy. As each year went by, in the troubled condition of the world, and against the background of Britain's ever-present economic weakness, they became more difficult and more thankless. In the years after 1956, it became clear that Britain's status in the world had changed. Now, I don't think anybody is yet clear what our new position is. Looking back, I can see that the process has been going on all through my life. When my father was First Sea Lord, we were by far the greatest naval power in the world, with by far the largest empire. After 1918, the empire turned into a Commonwealth, and we could no longer afford to remain preeminent at sea. After 1945, there were even greater changes. As last Viceroy, I transferred power in India. I assisted at the birth of Pakistan and at the independence of Ceylon. Burma opted out, to my great regret. Yet, right up to 1955, when I ceased to be Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, the fleets of the Royal Navy had remained a force to be reckoned with. But after 1956, it became sadly apparent that power, in the military sense, really lay with the superstates, America and Russia, with China beginning to come forward fast. Our foreign policy has been forced to recognize this more and more. We now have to depend on our alliances. A wind of change, as Harold McMillan described it, again changed the Commonwealth, and we haven't yet seen the end of that process. We've been caught up in an economic revolution, and we haven't found the answers to that. Defense policy has had to be adjusted to all these circumstances. I don't suppose there's ever been such a period of rapid, drastic change in which all fundamental defense questions have been so difficult to answer. The whole field, our alliances, our commitments, our weapons, our bases, our means of communication, have all had to be re-examined in the most critical manner. This is very largely due to the quite astonishing and ever-accelerating revolution in technology which has been taking place. The Americans have hit the nail on the head when they say, if it works, it's obsolete.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
1959 was an astonishing technological year. The great powers had invented a new status symbol, the space race. And this year, the great costly space programs of the United States and Russia produced remarkable results. In January, the Soviet Union launched the cosmic rocket Lunik 1. The Americans sent up an artificial planet, Pioneer 4, in March, and in June, we had the British rocket Black Knight. But these achievements were only appetizers. On October the 4th, Lunik 3 succeeded in photographing the moon, an almost unbelievable extension of human knowledge. Manned flight in space soon followed. Both the Russians and the Americans put up their astronauts, and we became familiar with the names of the new pathfinders, Gagarin, Glenn, and their fellows. President Kennedy, just a few months before he was killed, defined their achievement.
We're delighted to honor today the most recent of this very exclusive group, Major Cooper, who went furthest in space and did so on the anniversary of Charles Lindbergh's flight to Paris. Charles Lindbergh took approximately the same time to go about 1/150th of the distance of Major Cooper. Both flights were equally hazardous, both were equally daring. I think one of the things which warmed us the most during this flight was the realization that however extraordinary computers may be, that we are still ahead of them, and that man is still the most extraordinary computer of all. His judgment, his nerve, and the lessons he can learn from experience still make him unique.
Progress wasn't only happening in space. I was particularly pleased with the success of a new British invention, the hovercraft. In July 1959, one of these new craft showed its potential by crossing the Channel. In the very early days, when the inventor, Cockerell, could find no one to back him, he finally wrote to me, and I was able to get him the government support he needed. That's why I got such a kick when the new seagoing class of hovercraft in 1968 was named after me. I find it exciting living in an age of technological progress. In fact, quite recently, one of our brighter comedians impersonated me on a skit on television. And he had me saying, actually, I invented technology. Well, anyway, I've never been afraid of it. In the Navy, as a wireless officer, I specialized in communications. But I've never been able to resist sticking a finger into other pies as well. I invented a number of things, some of them just gadgets, some of them important enough to have patented and to be adopted by the Admiralty. There was my subfocal signaling shutter, my wireless wavelength calculator, my course ruler, the M-type torpedo sight, and the one I'm proudest of, my station-keeping device, which would take far too long to explain, but which may be said to have saved my life, because I stood on it when the Kelly capsized at Crete and I had to swim clear of the bridge. As First Sea Lord, as well as streamlining the Navy, I did my best to fit it to take its part in this age of nuclear power, computers, and missiles. The counter-class guided missile destroyers were my special babies. Beautiful ships and splendid examples of computerized electronic efficiency. And I was determined to introduce nuclear propulsion. That was a struggle. First, there was the question of know-how. This I was able to overcome by making friends with Admiral Rickover of the U.S. Navy, the father of nuclear propulsion, who gave us invaluable help. Then there was the question of cost. When Admiral Fisher started a naval revolution in 1906 with the design of HMS Dreadnought, the prototype of all Dreadnought battleships, her building took a year and a day, and that great ship cost just under £1,800,000.
I named this ship Dreadnought. May God bless her and all who serve in her.
Our Dreadnought, half a century later, our first nuclear-powered submarine, was also revolutionary. But she took nearly 3 times as long to build, and she cost 10 times as much. However, I was able to win over the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and work began on her in 1958.
In July 1959, Mountbatten was appointed Chief of the Defence Staff. The event marked the inauguration of the most sweeping changes ever to take place in the British Armed Forces, more revolutionary than the Fisher naval reforms and the Haldane army reforms, which had transformed the services before 1914.
The idea of the reorganization of defense didn't suddenly dawn on me. It was the result of 20 years' experience in war and peace. It was what one might call an intellectual fulfillment, whereas being first SEAL was more of a sentimental fulfillment. I could hardly believe my good luck in being able to achieve both these things, because what was happening now was really the conclusion of something which began as far back as 1941, when I went to combined operations. That was when the idea of inter-service organization and operations really took hold of me. In combined operations, we demonstrated that it was possible for Army, Navy, and Air Force people to sync their service identities completely and work as one outfit. In SEAC, with its integrated inter-allied staff, the same thing applied. My SEAC staff and those of the other Supreme Commanders showed that national identities, as well as service identities, could be submerged. I was horrified when this structure was abandoned in Southeast Asia after I had left, in spite of my strongest protests. But NATO brought it to life again, and I was able to organize my Allied Forces headquarters in Malta on similar lines in 1953. I was certain that this was the only way to wage modern war. Plans, organization, logistics, operations, all demanded complete cooperation. And this has to be built in peacetime. You simply can't rely on working it all up at the last moment. Once again, I knew I was in for a terrific struggle, because I would be up against tradition and vested interest, a formidable combination. In fact, one senior officer told me quite frankly, when I took over as CDS, that he regarded my appointment as the greatest disaster which had befallen the British Defence Services within his memory. I knew I was going to antagonize a lot of people, but I couldn't help that.
All through the years of Mountbatten's eminence, his image had been coupled with another, Edwina Mountbatten, Lady Louis, as she was known to many thousands. Their public lives had dramatically come together during the war, when Lady Mountbatten had risen as swiftly to the top in her own field, the Red Cross and St. John, as her husband in the sphere of high command. In Southeast Asia, they had worked closely together on the rescue and repatriation of prisoners of war. In India, as Vice Reign, Lady Mountbatten had made an unforgettable impact, among ordinary people, perhaps greater than her husband's. She had been seen and admired at Mountbatten's side when he resumed his naval career in 1948 and climbed the ladder from Rear Admiral to First Sea Lord. But her work for the Red Cross and St. John never ceased. She gave herself to this without stint, refusing to recognize the clear symptoms of illness through overwork.
The warmth and the spirit of American generosity has touched us more deeply than I can ever hope to tell you. But I want you to believe how vital and invaluable your help has been to us, how much we have relied on it in the hours of our greatest needs, and the immense gratitude we feel towards you.
In February 1960, there was a happy family occasion. The wedding of the Mountbatten's younger daughter, Pamela, to the interior decorator, David Hicks.
My wife, Edwina, was on the top of her form at Pamela's wedding. I had never known her more gay, more happy, more lovely in recent years. Everybody remarked on it. As somebody said afterwards, it was like a candle that flares up just before it gutters and goes out. 4 days after the wedding, she went away on a tour of the Far East as Superintendent-in-Chief of St. John. She shouldn't have gone, of course, but we couldn't stop her. We tried to get her to cut down her program, but typically she wouldn't hear of it. She must have been dying on her feet, but her sense of duty drove her on right to the end. I found out afterwards that on the last night of her life, after a full day in Borneo, she insisted on going to an official party. 2 ladies had to support her by the elbows as far as the door. And then she pushed them aside and drew herself erect and walked in and sparkled, as she always did. That night she went to bed and never woke again. I heard the news by telephone, I suppose, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a poleaxe blow. I simply couldn't grasp it. I didn't have time to, because as soon as the news came out, the heavens opened. I received over 6,000 telegrams and letters from kings, presidents, prime ministers, governors. But what astonished me, at least 5,000 of them were from people in all walks of life, from many countries, who said they were her personal friends. I'm sure they were, and yet I'd never even heard of them. Edwina had asked in her will to be buried at sea. I wasn't too sure about this, but I was wrong. The First Sea Lord at once offered a frigate. Not only that, he came down himself, and with him the Commander-in-Chief, Portsmouth, and all his senior officers. And the Indian government insisted that one of their frigates should accompany her as her last Indian escort. I was deeply touched at this unique tribute from 2 navies. And it was then, I think, as we committed her to the sea, that the sense of loss really came home to me.
Mountbatten returned to work a lonely figure, without the brave and brilliant woman who had supported him for so long. but no less dedicated to the work which he had set in hand. He was due to retire in 1962, but the Prime Minister prevailed on him to stay on.
My reason for wanting him to stay was simple. I was very anxious that we should make further progress in a movement which had already begun to bring the High Command, organization, and control of the three services into a single unit. I do not mean that it was our idea then, and I hope will never be, to try to turn Army, Navy, and Air Force into what Churchill would have called a sludgy amalgam. I meant that from my experience in war, where I'd seen a good deal, and since the war, it was clear that any operations, large or small, would be joint operations, by air, by sea, by land. Commanders would have to be supreme commanders, chosen from one service, but commanding the operation or the station. But if that was necessary in operations, surely it was equally necessary in planning. And therefore we conceived the idea of bringing together the top echelons of the three services into a single unit, making them in reality a Ministry of Defense. This involved most complicated arrangements about the ministers concerned, about the abolition of the old Board of Admiralty, one of the oldest and most respected of all English structures. And it involved, of course, the abolition as such of the Army Council and the Air Council, which were of more recent origin. To do all this, to override some of the feelings of old-fashioned officers and critics, we needed a man of authority and drive. And I felt that in Lord Mountbatten we had the man.
This is the Chiefs of Staff room in our new unified Ministry of Defense, completed in 1964. I like to think of this room as being symbolic of what I was trying to do. We carried out a work study to ensure that it was absolutely functional. In session in this room, the Chiefs of Staff can be linked whenever they like to operations room in the Ministry or overseas commands. On those screens, they can be seeing exactly the same maps and teleprinter conversations as an overseas commander-in-chief, and at the same moment. They can receive information and transmit orders by these means with a minimum of fuss. All this, of course, was planned to meet the demands of our world commitments. Our overseas bases were part of the apparatus for dealing with what we called brush fires, those sudden, dangerous contingencies which have to be dealt with instantly, and of which there never seemed to be any lack. Bases, of course, are vulnerable, so in addition, we also had flexible amphibious task forces ready for instant action. As long as we intended to uphold our alliances and our Commonwealth ties, a coordinating nerve center like this was vital. I regard this as a headquarters rather than the old-fashioned committee room. We British have always liked to wage war by committee, but during the Second World War, we learned to accept the Supreme Commander principle, and all subsequent experience showed that you can't do without it. After I became CDS, I was able to reintroduce Supreme Command, or Unified Command as we now call it, in all our overseas theaters. In the Far East, as it turned out, this happened just in time.
In 1962, British policy was to set up a Malaysian federation which would add economic and political unity to the fragmented independence of that part of Southeast Asia. The implementation of this policy put Mountbatten's apparatus to its first test. Indonesia bitterly opposed the concept of Malaysia. Once again, the British defense system faced the threat of escalating war. In December 1962, there were Indonesian-inspired revolts in Brunei and Sarawak, which were quickly crushed with the help of British troops. In 1963, Indonesian irregulars appeared openly in attacks on Malaysian territory. Confrontation had begun. British forces were increasingly drawn in. It was a strange war, without pitched battles, but constantly imposing great strain on small units, requiring great initiative from junior commanders, skillful intelligence work, and complete cooperation between all units and services.
The new command system, under a unified C&C, who was in effect a supreme commander, ensured their cooperation as I knew it would. The services worked splendidly together, and they all had a hard job to do. The Navy's task, besides giving all support to the Army, was really to discourage escalation, to convince the Indonesians that it was impossible to launch a large-scale invasion across the narrow strip of water that separates them from Singapore. We made a brave show in eastern waters, and it did the trick. Confrontation ended in 1966. We'd won this war quietly, efficiently, and at very low cost in life. By this time, I had retired from the post of Chief of the Defense Staff. It was gratifying to me that the last major enterprise of the services in which I was involved should have had such a happy outcome. Saying goodbye, of course, was not so happy. It's a bleak moment when you realize that you've reached the end of something that had occupied almost the whole of your life. I'd been in uniform for 52 years. I'd always been proud of that uniform, proud and happy. As a young midshipman, I wept when I left my first ship, Admiral Beatty's flagship, the Lamb. I dare say I thought I should never love another ship so much. But of course, I did. The Navy gave me great happiness. How lucky I am to be an Admiral of the Fleet. An Admiral of the Fleet never retires. So I've never had to think of myself as leaving the Navy. I still belong to it, and the Navy will always be a very big part of me. And so I came home to Broadlands, but this time with some trepidation. Till now I kept myself too busy to realize this, but now I knew that this was an empty place, and that I'd have to keep house by myself. And I'd have to face up to this fact, because there was no longer a job to keep me away and to occupy every minute of my time. I'd always been used to a very active life. Now I wondered what I'd find to be active about. I must confess, I was rather frightened at this lonely prospect.